The town of Yotsuhara, nestled in a secluded valley, was famous for its festivals. Each season brought a new celebration: rice harvest in spring, lanterns in summer, moon viewing in autumn. But it was the winter feast that brought the most visitors, lured by tales of dishes so sumptuous they would haunt your dreams. Travelers came from all over the country, hoping to indulge in the festival's endless banquets. This year, it was different. It began when the festival's chief organizer, Matsuo, noticed something peculiar. Despite tables overflowing with food, laden with golden brown roasted meats and stews spiced to perfection, people ate in silence. There was none of the usual chatter or laughter. Guests hunched over their plates, devouring meal after meal without pause. Matsuo thought nothing of it at first. Perhaps they were simply enjoying the food too much to speak. But then, the complaints started. It was subtle at first. A woman approached Matsuo, eyes wide and fearful. "I'm still hungry," she whispered, her voice trembling. Matsuo glanced at her plate, empty but licked clean. "There's plenty more," he reassured her, gesturing toward the tables. She nodded and returned to her seat. But it didn't stop. Hours later he saw her again, now visibly shaking, still eating, her eyes hollow, skin pale. By the second night, whispers had spread throughout Yotsuhara. People were ravenous. No matter how much they consumed, an insatiable hunger gnawed at them. Food tasted delicious, but with each bite, they felt emptier. Matsuo couldn't ignore it anymore when he himself woke in the middle of the night, stomach cramping with a hunger so deep it felt as though his insides were shriveling. He rushed to his kitchen, inhaling anything he could find: rice, miso, pickled vegetables. But the more he ate, the more the emptiness grew, spreading like a sickness through his bones. In the streets, people gorged themselves in frantic silence. Children begged for more sweets. Old men crammed bread into their mouths with trembling hands. But everyone's faces were pale, gaunt, eyes sinking further into darkened sockets. The town's vibrancy dimmed, swallowed by the quiet, desperate sounds of chewing and swallowing. No one spoke of leaving. They couldn't. Something about Yotsuhara's atmosphere felt wrong. There was an oppressive weight in the air, like the town itself was watching, waiting. And at the edges of the streets, beyond the last festival lanterns, shadows flickered, twisting unnaturally in the dark. On the third night, Matsuo's hunger became unbearable. He stumbled to the festival grounds, where food still glistened on tables, untouched now, as no one could bear the sight of it. Even so, the scent tempted him. Sweet, warm, intoxicating. His hands shook as he reached for a bowl of broth, and just as the spoon touched his lips, a rustling sound made him pause. Across the square he saw her. A figure crouched low at the edge of the lamplight, her body hunched and thin. Matsuo recognized her immediately, the woman who had first complained. But now she was almost unrecognizable, her skin stretched tight over bones, eyes gleaming with a feverish hunger. She crawled toward the banquet table, limbs moving with an unnatural, jerky motion, her lips twitching into a ghastly smile. Her fingers, bony and claw-like, hovered over the food but never touched it. Matsuo watched, frozen in place, as her mouth opened wide, not to eat, but to breathe deeply, savoring the scent, like an animal catching the last whiff of prey. Then, her head snapped toward him. "You're still hungry, aren't you?" she rasped, her voice a brittle whisper that echoed in the silence. Matsuo couldn't answer. His throat was dry, his stomach hollowed out by a hunger so vast it consumed every thought, every breath. She slithered closer, her body barely recognizable as human now. never ends, you know," she whispered. "The hunger, it's not yours anymore." Matsuo's vision blurred, and his head swam with the suffocating sensation of emptiness. The food before him no longer mattered. Nothing did. The hunger had burrowed too deep. He staggered backward, his eyes flickering toward the edge of the square, where shadows twisted unnervingly, elongating, distorting. Something waited there. A shape, barely visible, crouched just beyond the light. It shifted, moving with fluid, predatory grace, but its form was indistinct, more an impression than a figure, its presence felt rather than seen. Matsuo stumbled, collapsing to his knees as the woman crawled closer, her bony fingers brushing the edge of his clothes. "It's waiting for all of us," she murmured, her voice now tinged with a sick, anticipatory glee. Matsuo gasped for air, his stomach tightening in agony. His body felt foreign, hollow, as if something unseen had carved him out from the inside, leaving nothing but the gnawing void. And then with a final painful breath, he understood. They were already part of it, the town, the feast, the hunger. It had consumed them long ago. They were nothing more than vessels, emptied, waiting for whatever lay in the darkness to finally claim them. The shadow shifted again, closer now, a whisper of movement at the edge of the square. Matsuo closed his eyes and waited.
It began as a whisper. Sana first noticed it one evening, just as the cicadas fell silent. A soft murmuring inside her head, like distant voices conversing behind a door. She pressed her palms against her temples, hoping to quiet the sound, but it grew louder, spreading tendrils of unease through her thoughts. For days, the voices ebbed and flowed like tides, sometimes quiet enough that she could almost ignore them. But they always returned, stronger, pulling her deeper into their rhythm. At first, she thought it was stress from work or maybe the lack of sleep. But the headaches began, sharp, stabbing pains that dug behind her eyes. Then came the flowers. One morning, Sana woke up to find a small bud sprouting from her right ear. It was pale, fragile-looking, and strangely translucent. She stared at it in the mirror, her heart racing. With shaking hands, she reached up and plucked it out. It fell into her palm with a soft sigh, its stem wet with some clear fluid that smelled faintly sweet. She thought it might be an odd hallucination, a fragment of some fever dream. But the next day, another bloomed from her left nostril, this one a shade of deep violet, its petals heavy and cold against her skin. Panic gnawed at her, but there was no one she could talk to. Her mother had passed years ago, her friends distant shadows lost in the monotony of daily life. Sana told herself it was nothing, a bizarre skin condition, perhaps. But deep down, she knew. She felt it, the roots curling within her, threading through the crevices of her mind. By the third week, her bathroom was littered with tiny blossoms, each one more grotesque than the last. Crimson-tipped petals, black stems, flowers that bled a dark, oily sap. Worse still, each bloom brought with it a vision, something dark and repressed from her past. The first flower showed her a memory she had long buried, a glimpse of herself as a child, standing by the edge of the river. Her hands were wet, cold with the weight of something heavy. In her reflection, she saw the small body of her brother, limp and silent beneath the water's surface. She screamed and tore at the flowers, pulling at them desperately, but they only grew faster, sprouting from her ears, her nose, and even the corners of her eyes. Each one revealed another memory, another secret she had hidden from herself. She remembered the night her mother died, how it wasn't an accident, how the bottle of pills had not been misplaced but deliberately placed within reach. And with each new bloom, the weight of her guilt grew unbearable. Sana tried to escape the visions. She stopped looking in mirrors, avoided quiet places where her thoughts might surface. But the flowers continued to grow, relentless, choking her senses. She could no longer smell anything but the sickly sweet fragrance of decay. The colours blurred together, swirling in her vision, the walls of her apartment disappearing beneath the growth. It wasn't just her, though. She started seeing it in others. Strangers on the subway with pale buds at the tips of their ears. A man at the grocery store wiping away petals falling from his nose. They all walked with the same haunted look, eyes sunken and lost. None of them spoke about it. No one dared acknowledge the creeping bloom. Late one night, when the flowers had begun to crawl down her throat, she heard it again. The whisper. It was no longer distant, but clear, a voice inside her skull. "It's time to bloom," it said, soft yet insistent. Sana stood in front of the mirror, her face a twisted mass of petals and stems. She barely recognized herself anymore. The voice continued, whispering secrets she didn't want to hear, memories she wished she had forgotten. She tried to scream, but only a single petal fell from her lips. Then, with a shuddering breath, she stopped resisting. She let the flowers grow. By morning, her apartment was silent, the room filled with blossoms, their scent overwhelming. Beneath the petals, Sana's body lay still, her face entirely covered in flowers, her hands limp at her sides. In the corner, a small bud stirred. It was blooming again.
The coastal town of Kagura was always quiet, nestled between jagged cliffs and the restless sea. Fog clung to the streets, a constant veil that dulled the colors of the world and blurred the edges of reality. Fishermen whispered about strange tides, and the wind carried a faint, unearthly melody, like the plucking of unseen strings. It began with small things, a shiver in the bones, a twinge in the joints. Hannah was the first to speak of it openly. She stood on the pier, her face gaunt and pale, hands trembling as she gripped the railing. "They're in my body," she whispered to anyone who would listen. "I can feel them pulling, like threads inside me." The others dismissed her, muttering about exhaustion or too many long nights by the sea. But then it spread. One by one, people began to suffer from the same affliction. Their bodies stiffened, their bones seeming to disappear, replaced by something thin and unyielding beneath their skin. They moved slowly in the daylight, struggling against their own limbs as if their flesh had become a cage. But at night, they moved in ways that defied reason. The town awoke to the sound of creaking floorboards, the soft patter of footsteps on rooftops. Through windows, the afflicted could be seen in the streets, performing grotesque pantomimes. Limbs twisted in ways no human body should, bending at impossible angles, yet there was no cracking, no breaking, only the silent, inexorable pull of invisible strings. They moved as if guided by a cruel hand, acting out scenes too bizarre and unsettling to fully comprehend. One night, a group of fishermen danced in the square, their mouths sewn shut with strands of their own hair. Another night, Hannah could be seen walking backward into the sea, her head turning slowly on its neck to face the town as her body disappeared beneath the waves. No one stopped them. No one could. The few who remained unaffected shut themselves inside at night, barring their doors and windows, hoping the strange dance would pass by their homes. But curiosity lingered, an insidious itch that couldn't be ignored. Yuki was one of those who remained unscathed, though she felt the creeping weight of dread pressing in on her. Her mother had been among the first to show symptoms, her once lively face now hollow and listless. At night, Yuki watched her mother's silhouette move unnaturally behind the paper screen of their home, limbs jerking in eerie rhythmic motions. But she never looked directly. Fear rooted her to her futon, paralyzed by the growing certainty that if she did, something inside her would unravel, like a thread pulled too tightly. The final night came without warning. The wind shifted, carrying with it a rancid, salty stench from the ocean. That night, Yuki couldn't stop herself. The curiosity, the dread, it overwhelmed her, clawing at her mind until she rose and crept to the window. Outside, the entire town had gathered at the shore. In the moonlight, their bodies twitched and writhed, arms flailing as if they were nothing more than marionettes suspended by unseen strings. But it wasn't their movements that sent a chill down her spine. It was the sound. Low, droning, a deep groan emanating from beneath the sea, like something impossibly large stirring in its depths. The people's motions grew more frantic as the sound reverberated through the air, their bodies bending and snapping back into shape as though resisting the pull of something beneath the waves. Their faces twisted in grimaces of silent terror, but still their feet moved closer to the ocean's edge. Yuki's heart pounded. She couldn't tear her eyes away as the townsfolk waded into the water, their bodies still moving in that unnatural, puppet-like rhythm. The water swallowed them, one by one, until only their heads remained above the surface, their glassy eyes reflecting the pale moonlight. And then they sank, silently, without a struggle. The droning stopped. For a moment, all was still. Yuki stumbled back from the window, her breath ragged, chest tight. She could hear her mother now. Inside the house, the quiet creak of her footsteps, moving closer. The door to her room slid open, but Yuki didn't dare look. "I'm free," her mother's voice rasped, the words wet and strange, as if forced from a mouth not used to speaking. "The strings, they're gone." Yuki's throat tightened. Slowly, she turned to face her mother and screamed. The figure standing before her was not her mother. Its limbs sagged, skin hanging loosely over a skeletal frame, and its eyes were nothing but black, hollow pits. From beneath its thin, translucent flesh, Yuki saw the glint of something metallic. Fine, delicate wires crisscrossed through the body, strung so tightly they seemed ready to snap. "Come to the ocean," it whispered in a voice that was not her mother's. "We are waiting for you." Yuki's legs buckled, and as she collapsed to the floor, she heard the faint, haunting melody of the strings once more, rising from beneath the sea. Somewhere in the depths, something moved, and now it had found her.
The town of Hirasato was ordinary, a place tucked away in the valley between mountains, where life moved slowly and the wind whispered through the trees. For all its quaintness, the people carried an unspoken dread, woven into their daily lives like a dark thread. They never spoke of it, but every person knew. Every day, for 1 hour, their eyes would betray them. It always started the same way, a flutter of the eyelids, quick and harmless, as though a gust of wind had kicked up dust. But soon the blinking became erratic, uncontrollable. In that inescapable hour, no one could trust their sight. Between the blinks, fleeting images would flash, shadows that flickered in the periphery of vision, creeping ever closer. At first, most wrote it off as a trick of the mind, but the sensation lingered long after the hour passed, a pressure, a presence just outside the reach of full perception. Ichiro, a quiet man who had lived in Hirasato his entire life, had long since learned to ignore the blinking hour. He did what the others did, stayed inside, avoided mirrors, and kept his eyes fixed on the floor. The rule was simple: if you didn't look too closely, the shadows couldn't reach you. One cold autumn evening, Ichiro's blinking began earlier than usual. It happened while he was walking home, just after sunset. His vision stuttered, his surroundings becoming fragmented as his eyes flickered uncontrollably. With every blink, the world felt as though it shifted. Houses stretched taller, trees leaned in, their branches curling like skeletal fingers. It was in the intervals between those blinks that Ichiro first saw them. Standing at the edge of his vision, just beyond where his eyes could focus, was a figure. It didn't didn't move, but he felt its gaze, cold, heavy, and unyielding. With every blink, the figure multiplied, shadows flickering between the spaces of his sight. His pulse quickened. He walked faster, keeping his head down, trying to make it home before the hour fully took hold. But no matter how fast he walked, they were always there, waiting between his blinks, watching. Ichiro's breathing became shallow, each forced step pulling him deeper into a suffocating haze. He was close to his door when he felt it, a hand brushing lightly against his arm, but there was nothing when his eyes opened again. His vision blurred with each blink, and the figures, now many, moved closer, like a shifting mass in the dark. By the time he stumbled through his door, his eyes burned from the strain, and his heart hammered in his chest. Ichiro threw himself onto the floor, his body shaking as he forced his eyes shut, hoping, praying, that the hour would pass quickly. The clock ticked loudly in the silence. Ichiro kept his eyes closed for what felt like an eternity, trying to breathe steadily, telling himself it was only a few more minutes. But then, through the sound of his heartbeat, came something else. Whispers, faint and garbled, like words spoken through a veil. He squeezed his eyes tighter, not daring to look. Blink. It came involuntarily, his lids flicking open for a fraction of a second. This time the figures were closer, so close he could almost make out their shapes. Tall, twisted, their faces smooth and featureless. His heart leapt into his throat. He tried to force his eyes closed again, but his body betrayed him. He blinked once more. In that blink, the shadows were upon him, crowding his vision, their cold breath ghosting over his skin. And then it stopped. The blinking ceased as suddenly as it had begun. Ichiro lay still, drenched in sweat, the room bathed in the pale moonlight spilling through the window. The hour had passed. His breathing slowed, and the figures were gone, as if they had never been. He laughed shakily, telling himself it was over. He could still hear the ticking of the clock, steady and familiar. His pulse steadied, and his eyelids felt heavy with exhaustion. Everything was back to normal, except the clock had stopped ticking. It took a moment for Ichiro to realize what that meant. His heart thudded in his chest once more as he slowly opened his eyes. Standing beside his bed, unmoving, was one of the figures. It did not blink. The hour had passed, but they remained. In the silence that followed, Ichiro's eyes fluttered again, but this time, when they opened, he found he could no longer close them. The figures filled his vision now, their forms no longer slipping between blinks, but fully present, watching. He wanted to scream, but his mouth wouldn't move. His eyes stayed open as they leaned closer.
The mist hung low over the ancient woods, tendrils of fog winding through the skeletal branches like pale, reaching hands. Taro hadn't meant to stray so far from the path, but the shortcut through the forest had seemed harmless enough. It was only after the old man at the village's edge had warned him to stay away from the forbidden ground that curiosity had whispered its temptations. He had shrugged off the warnings, assuming they were just tales meant to frighten outsiders. But when his foot crossed the boundary marked by a crumbling stone, half submerged in the earth, something shifted. At first, it was nothing more than a faint thrum in the air, barely noticeable amid the whispers of wind. But that night, as Taro lay in his futon, the sound grew, a soft, rhythmic pulse. Thump, 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 thump. He pressed his palms to his ears, thinking it must be his own heartbeat, perhaps amplified by his exhaustion. But the rhythm was wrong. It was too slow, too deep, and it resonated with a weight that sent tremors through his bones. The next morning, the sound persisted. Thump, 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 thump. No matter where he went, no matter how much he tried to drown it out with noise, it was there, an echo beneath his thoughts. It wasn't until the third day that he began to notice the changes. His sleep grew shallow, interrupted by strange, half-remembered dreams of shadowy figures and cold earth. The pulse, constant growing, seemed to shift in tone, becoming more insistent, as though something was drawing nearer. He avoided the village, fearing their superstitions, and locked himself away in his small, dim apartment, hoping isolation might bring clarity. But clarity never came. Only the heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. It was on the fifth day that Taro realized, truly realized, that the heartbeat did not match his own. He tried syncing it to the rhythm of his chest, but no matter how he adjusted his breathing or held his breath, it continued, steady, unyielding, separate. Panic seized him. What was it? Where was it coming from? In the mirror, his face grew pale, hollow. The skin beneath his eyes sagged, dark from sleepless nights, and his lips grew thin, always pressed tight, as if to suppress some secret. His ears ached, the relentless thump driving needles of pain through his skull. He could barely think, barely eat. The heartbeat consumed everything. On the 7th day, Taro sought out the old man. He found him sitting outside his weathered shack, the same inscrutable look on his face as when they had first met. When Taro, wild-eyed and desperate, explained his condition, the old man only nodded slowly, as if he had been expecting this. "You crossed the stone," the man said, his voice a hollow rasp. "It wasn't a boundary to keep you out, it was to keep it in." Taro's mouth went dry. He wanted to ask what the old man meant, but the words stuck in his throat. "Whatever you hear," the man continued, his eyes distant, "it has been waiting, buried in the earth for longer than we can remember. It awakens slowly. Each beat you hear is its heart. You've become connected." "What do I do?" Taro asked, his voice cracking. The old man only looked away, his expression darkening with a sadness that chilled Taro to the core. "You don't—" By the 10th day, Taro could barely function. The heartbeat now reverberated through his body, shaking his bones, his thoughts scattered and fevered. The sound had grown louder, no longer just in his ears, but in the floor beneath him, the walls, the very earth. He felt it. In every step he took, in every breath he inhaled, the pulse thrummed through him. Desperation overtook him, and in a haze of fear he returned to the forbidden site. Perhaps if he went back, he could undo whatever curse he had invoked. He stood over the crumbling stone, his vision swimming as the world seemed to warp around him, bending to the rhythm of the heartbeat. Thump, 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 thump. He fell to his knees, pressing his hands into the earth, as if digging might silence the terrible sound. That's when he felt it. Beneath his fingertips, the soil shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but there, something moving. No, not moving, beating. His breath caught in his throat as the ground beneath him pulsed. Thump, 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 thump. A low rumble rose from the depths, a sound older than time itself, as though the earth was drawing breath for the first time in millennia. Taro scrambled backward, terror surging through him, but it was too late. The heartbeat quickened, matching the frantic pounding of his own chest. And then it stopped. Silence. For a moment, there was nothing, just the cold, oppressive weight of the earth beneath him. But in that silence, Taro felt something watching, something awake. And from deep within the earth, he heard it. A single, final beat. Thump. It wasn't his heart that stopped. It was his own pulse that never came again.